This is a bit of a presentation on the site of Mycenae and the palaces located there and what can it tell us about Mycenaean civilization. So far we've taken a look at the island of Crete and Knossos, and as we saw there, without any sort of written records or kind of histories written by the people themselves, we're dependent upon archaeology and material remains, the kind of goods that we find on the ground, to help us kind of reconstruct these civilizations, and then also try to make some sort of educated guesses on the type of political structure or the social structures, some of the kind of important artistic motifs, some of their accomplishments, and so on in those regards. So material remains are so important, and as I say, now that we've done it for the site of Knossos, what I want to do now is take a look at the mainland, and particularly take a look at the site of Mycenae. Now, if you see on this map here, you can see on the mainland a number of different sites. So you see Mycenae kind of centrally located right here, but there's other places called Pylos and Tiryns and so on. Now these are all known as kind of Mycenaean palaces, although the main site is of course Mycenae. But there's many similarities, as we'll see, between these. But what we want to focus on is the site of Mycenae itself, and then take a look at its development and some of its defining characteristics. So if we take a look at an aerial view of Mycenae, this is what it looks like today. So it might be a little bit confusing there, but as I say, we're used to Knossos, so it kind of should be not much of a surprise to us. You can see the walls and so on. Now, of course, as this presentation goes on, I'll try to draw your attention to certain details and it'll become much clearer to you. But I think even at first glance, if we're trying to compare Mycenae with the palaces on Crete and at Knossos and other places, I think one thing we can say already is that there's some fundamental differences here. The primary one being that, as you'll notice, all the Mycenaean palaces take advantage of natural fortifications. That is, all these palace complexes are built on hills, kind of rocky outcrops and so forth. So if you take a look here, it doesn't come as clear here, but you'll see it in subsequent slides. If you notice, the entire palace is built on a very kind of elevated position. Right? It's kind of tough to see here, but I'm kind of circling it there. Now this is important because clearly these palaces have a concern with defensive fortifications, and it only makes sense to take advantage of the natural surroundings. So in other words, they built on an elevated position, and then also added walls at a much later period. So they're very concerned with defense, and also see this is a lot different from what we saw on Crete and at Knossos, because if you remember there were absolutely no walls whatsoever. Perhaps they were a naval force, we're not too sure, but no walls. And the palace there, remember, was actually built in a valley, so it didn't take advantage of any sort of natural fortifications. So right off the bat there, we can see that there are some differences with Knossos. Now, to kind of maybe get a sense of what it would look like at the time, here is one reconstruction of Mycenae at its peak, at the height of its development. So you can see here, well, it's all labeled, right? But some of the things that will become clear through the course of this presentation. You'll see right here where it says Lion's Gate, that's essentially the main entrance to the citadel, to the palace. So that's really the only main entry point right here. And you can see then there's a ramp that goes up into the city. Other things that you'll see we'll take a look at, of course, the surrounding walls. Now those are very late in Mycenae's history, and we'll talk about that. Then we see what's called a grave circle, basically a cemetery right there. We'll be taking a look at that. And then near the top, what you'll see is something called a megaron, and the kind of palace of the king or the chief. That's another thing that we'll be taking a look at. And it's a distinctive element of Mycenaean palaces. Remember, if you look back at Knossos, their kind of distinguishing feature, a central feature of those palaces was that central courtyard. Well, it seems in the mainland, one of the distinctive features is this kind of great hall or room that is known as a megaron in Greek. Now I have a couple of kind of maps and floor plans for you in this slide and the next, just to kind of give you a sense of the layout and some of the names that we'll be talking about. Now this one, as you can see, it's in Greek and English, but you can kind of see here, there's that grave circle, there's a Lion's Gate. So this is, you can see it, the main palace right here. Why I include this one is you'll notice when we get down to where it says 2 and 3 and other places, you have to understand this is all kind of the hillside. And what's important is that those are these tombs known as thalos tombs, which we'll be taking a look at. So I just kind of give you a kind of heads up here to give you a sense spatially of where those are located. We'll get to those in turn though. And then what we have here, this is a kind of map or floor plan of the palace itself. So just to orient you here, you can see here's the Lion's Gate, the dark shaded area, that's the wall. Here's the grave circle, and here's the Megaron or palace located right here. Now, what I want to do is I want to take a look at the palaces here and everything that's kind of found on the citadel, but I want to do it in a way that helps to explain Mycenaean development. That is, how did we these obviously were built generation after generation. So what we can do, and this is kind of building upon what your textbook says, we can trace a little bit of development here. So what I want to do here is take a look at 3 features of the palaces, these 3 eras. The first is called the shaft grave era. The second is what's known as the Thalos tomb period, just after a type of tomb that's built during those years. And then finally, the period of the palaces, where we see the building of the walls and so on. Now, these are just 3 categories that your textbook uses to trace Mycenaean civilization. Now, clearly, these are dates and titles that are assigned by later historians. So the Mycenaeans themselves, of course, had no idea of these things. And I also want to let you know that these dates are all kind of approximate. That's why it says CA before them. That just means circa, because we're not dealing with exact dates here. So just realize that these aren't kind of official periods and the dates aren't kind of official either, but they're generally accurate. And what they're effective for is it does help. If we think in these terms, it helps us put together in a somewhat simpler way a lot of kind of complex material. So this is what I'm going to do, is that when I'm taking a look at the site here, I'm going to go through each of these phases or periods in turn and just try to show you how not only kind of what each represents and the distinguishing features of each, but really try to stress to you and kind of draw out and tease out how we see these periods really kind of underscore the development of Mycenae and its growing kind of political and economic power. Okay, we're going to begin by taking a look at what's known as the shaft grave era. And it's known as such because of these grave circles, shaft graves that were discovered at Mycenae. Now, what we're looking at down is right in this area here, this circular area that says grave circle. Now, as I mentioned earlier in this presentation, the walls that you see, these are later. Okay, so what you have to understand is that this cemetery, this grave circle, was originally kind of outside the living space of the citadel of the palace complex here. Usually, and this is true of both Greece and Rome, that cemeteries were located kind of outside of city limits. But as Mycenaean population and power expanded and the site itself expanded, they needed more space. What resulted is that that grave circle was eventually incorporated within the walls. Okay, so it wasn't originally looking like this. This was kind of on the outskirts of the city, if you will. So what we're going to take a look at here are the graves that were discovered there. Now, why they're so important is that we can see some kind of technique and technology being used to build these. But what's even perhaps more important is the goods and the products that were found within the graves, because this gives us insight into the type of people that constructed these. So if we take a look here, here is an aerial view of one of these grave circles. And within the circle, you can see there's a number of what are called shaft graves. So I'm kind of highlighting one here. If I go ahead to the next one, here you can see it too. So here's another shaft down here. Now this is a pretty simple way of kind of burying people. Basically all you do is you dig out a deep pit or a shaft. You place the body in there along with, say, grave goods, meaning kind of swords or money or whatever. You kind of bury the person on top, kind of refill it with earth and so on. Now these were kind of reusable graves. So if a kind of king died and then later a son or a wife died, then it could be reopened and that person could be interred there as well. Now I also want to make it clear that not only were these kind of family graves, but This is clearly a burial place for the elite, for the rich and the powerful in Mycenae. Not every person would have this, only the kind of leading families. Okay. Another thing that's kind of important, I've kind of alluded to this, is not only do we see, okay, people making these shaft graves and so on, it exhibits a bit of technique, but also because these individuals were buried with items that were considered important to them. Now, what we're fortunate here is that in very many places in the Greek world, in Egypt and other kind of ancient societies and cultures, so many tombs have been robbed. That's just a problem that we face, people looking for these valuable antiquities to sell for profit. Now, we're very fortunate here at Mycenae because these shaft graves were not. And when the first archaeologist, Heinrich Schliemann, whose name is in your textbook, uncovered Mycenae and found these shaft graves with all their contents, it was, of course, a fascinating find, just because of the amount of material that was covered there. So what I'm going to show you on the next couple slides is some of the things that were discovered. So we found a lot of these. These are called death masks. And what it is, it's a very thin kind of gold leaf that is kind of made to resemble the deceased and placed on his or her face before they're kind of interred. And we see a number of these. This is the so-called mask of Agamemnon. Agamemnon was the legendary king of Mycenae, according to Homer, the epic poet. So when Schliemann found this one, he kind of thought that he was looking upon the face of Agamemnon. But it's just a death mask, and we see a number of them. But you can see how it's kind of beaten out to a very thin thickness, if you will. Another thing we find is, say, more gold. This is what's known as a diadem. It's kind of like a headdress, so it'll be placed around the top of the head. Now, how you have to imagine this is, again, this is very thin gold, so it's very light. And then what you do is you have a leather string or strap that we place through this area right here, which would then hold it together, and you could tie it on somebody's head. So lots of gold. Clearly, this is a valuable material. So what they're kind of boasting about is, say, their wealth. The other thing that's surprising that we find a lot here that really distinguishes the Mycenaeans is we find a lot of artifacts that are connected with warfare. And this, again, just as I said earlier, that the fortifications at Mycenae distinguish it from the Minoan palaces, the same thing goes with the weaponry. If you remember looking back to Knossos, most of the art was kind of nature motifs or scenes from society, kind of court life and that kind of thing, priests perhaps, bull jumping and so on. But when we turn to Mycenae and we take a look at some of their kind of fine crafts, they often have a kind of military bent. So what we're dealing with here is clearly more of what your textbook labels a warrior culture. So again, the kind of grave goods are important because they stress what's important to that society. Okay, so here we see all sorts of kind of weaponry, swords. You can see some of them broken down, kind of oxidized. Bronze and other things doesn't work that well, doesn't survive that well, the elements, whereas gold and other things are a little bit better. And there are more examples of this. So if you take a look at, okay, here's 2 or 3 swords here, but then on the next slide, what we see is the inlay from a sword. So you can see here's the bronze itself, right, of the blade, but then this is this decorative inlay. So you can see what's going on here. It's a lion hunt. So here's the lion, and then you have the people hiding behind their shields and so forth. So it's a hunting scene. Now, hunting is an aristocratic activity in the ancient world because you needed leisure time, you needed money, and all these kind of things, especially when it comes, say, to a lion hunt. And even the image of the lion is kind of important or revealing because, as you might suspect, there's not too many lions in Greece. But when we see this sort of thing, what this tells us is that these Mycenaeans have contact with maybe people from Africa or the Near East, where lions maybe are a more common occurrence. So what this tells us is that we see signs of contact, is that these people are trading goods and so forth, and these are these goods that the Mycenaeans like, and they're being sought out. Another kind of find that reinforces this idea of kind of a warrior culture at Mycenae is this ring. You see it behind it, you can see where the finger would go. But here's these seal rings, all right? They kind of make an impression if pressed against, say, clay or wax or what have you. Now, we saw some of these in Minoan culture, but if you remember there, they had goddesses on them. They had bull jumping. But if you take a look, excuse me, the ones produced at Mycenae or we should say more accurately, for the Mycenaeans, it's a war scene. So what you have here is you can see here's a warrior standing up and he has a weapon that he's about to thrust down into the warrior that's kind of on his knees and with his shield and so on. Another injured warrior on this side. So again, the products that are being produced for the Mycenaeans are these ones with military motifs. So clearly this is what they kind of glorify. The last one I'll show you here is what's known as a rhyton, R-H-Y-T-O-N. And this is basically just a vessel used for pouring liquids, especially in kind of religious or cult contexts. Before Greeks made a sacrifice, they'd often, there was many components of it, one of which was pouring an offering to the gods, a liquid offering. It could be water, it could be milk, it could be wine, it could even be honey and that kind of thing. And you'd pour it from a vessel known as a rhyton. So that's what this would be used for. The fluid would perhaps be placed in here and then would flow out its nose or its mouth. So it's used in kind of cult purposes or religious purposes. But what's kind of interesting about this one, found in a grave in Mycenae, is when we think of bulls, we think of Knossos because of all the bull motifs there. So just given the quality of the grave goods that we found here, what it suggests to us, or to archaeologists, I should say, and historians, is that there's kind of clear sign of Minoan influence here. In other words, we've seen that the Minoans were kind of famous for their craftsmanship. So what it seems to have happened here is that perhaps they were selling goods to the Mycenaeans at this early stage, and that they knew what the Mycenaeans wanted. Or perhaps, as people suggested, perhaps the Minoans had set up a factory at Mycenae, and there, at that site, were producing goods that the Mycenaeans want. And of course, you have to produce. If you want to sell, you have to produce what people want. So they couldn't really necessarily sell them all the nature motifs from what they're familiar with. So they went with what the Mycenaeans wanted, and that's kind of hunting scenes, war scenes, and so on. Okay, so even this kind of tells us at this early stage of the shaft grave development, the Mycenaeans and the Minoans were trading with one another. Okay, so there's the first era in Mycenaean civilization, kind of conveniently known as the shaft grave era. So if we're looking at this stage of development, kind of 1600 to 1500 BC, this tells us that, oh, we're dealing with a culture that's developing. They're not quite on the scales of the Minoans yet, right? They don't have a huge palace complex or anything like that, but they're building these shaft graves and they have the money to kind of put weapons and these gold objects and so on. So they're kind of getting involved in what's known as aristocratic display. They're kind of flaunting or putting on display their wealth and their power. And it's still at a relatively kind of minor stage, just with these shaft graves, which are, they take some technique, but we're talking about digging a hole in the ground. It's not too bad. But where we start to see the next stage and kind of Mycenaean power growing is with the second period known as the Thalos tomb period. You can see that's roughly the 100 years after that. Now, this is kind of interesting because it too, it's talking about a specific type of burial, but as we'll see, it's a much more advanced structure than happened with the shaft graves. So, if we look back, okay, here's our aerial view of Mycenae. Now, again, I'm trying to give you a spatial sense of where these new tombs are located. Now, remember, this is located on a kind of a hilltop. You can see it around here, so it's very hilly. All right, and then if we take a look at this other map that I gave you, okay, there's the palace and so forth. Now you can see all the gradations here in the map. That just tells you that, okay, this is elevated because that's just marking differences in altitude and elevation. But then when you see where it says 2 and 3 and 4, these are some of these Thalos tombs. Now they're built into the side of the hills. So that's what I'm drawing your attention to. They're not located in kind of citadel itself, but on the outside. So if we take a look at what they look at today, here's looking from the citadel down, and here you can kind of barely make it out right here, but it's built into that hill. This is one of these Thalos tombs, okay? So that gives you a sense of what it'll look like from a distance. Here's what they look like when reconstructed. Now what you have to understand is all this cross hatched area, that's the earth, that's this ground, and here's the top of the ground. And here's the tomb itself. Right. Thalos means beehive in Greek, so that's why it's thought to look a little bit like a beehive. But what happens here is that this is much different from a shaft grave, because what happens here is they basically hollow out a space in the earth, line it with stones, right, build it to a tip, cover it over with earth, right, and then it becomes like an underground crypt. And this is like a door right here where you'd enter or re-enter and bury the bodies. So it's kind of like the shaft graves in terms of a kind of communal burial spot for the chief, the king, or the upper classes. But it's much more of an accomplishment when you think of architecture or technology. This might give you a better sense of what it would have looked like. It's kind of a cross section of it. So right here, what you see, this is the main entry point coming through here. You can see the people walking up. Here's, in a sense, the kind of front door. And here's the tomb itself, the thalos, and the earth covering on top. So you can see basically the bodies will be placed right into the floor right here. Okay, so there's this walkway, and then the thalos is the tomb itself. Now, when we get to Mycenae, here's what it looks like today. There's 9 of these thalos tombs in the surrounding area, but this is one of the best preserved in the Vegas. But you can see here just what a step up we're talking about in terms of technology and engineering. Shaft graves, you could dig a hole in the ground, but here we're dealing with massive pieces of stone and just a huge complex too. So these stones, not only do they have to be kind of quarried and cut, but then brought on site and then lifted up. And some of them are massive. This stone right here that's above the front doorway, between the doorway and what's called the relieving triangle, we're talking about a stone that's tons and tons of weight. So when you're dealing with no kind of mechanized construction, right? There's no kind of hydraulics or anything like that. They're just dealing on kind of manpower or use of horses. So it's really quite an accomplishment. So that tells us, oh, okay, these people have more money because this is, of course, going to cost a lot of money to build. They have the technique and the expertise and so forth. So what it tells us, and this is why your textbook breaks it down in these phases, that, okay, now these Mycenaeans are developing, they have more wealth, they have more resources to do these sorts of things. And when you take a look at it from the inside, you see these students here, but you can see the scale, all right? And you can see just that stone above that, what's called the lintel stone, you can see the size of it. So the accomplishment, and we're talking about engineering, is really quite remarkable. Another one you can see here, what, oops, what this has here is, this gives you a sense of, there's the front door, and then this is called corbel vaulting, where it just kind of, as you go up to the top, it just kind of goes in and in and in until you have a top stone at the top there. But that gives you a nice sense of the scale of things and the accomplishment. Okay, so there are a number of those, as I say, in the surrounding hills around Mycenae. The unfortunate thing about them is that because they kind of stand out a little bit more than shaft graves, most of them were plundered. So although we find some things, most, I think, of the grave goods and the gold and the valuable things have been removed long ago. Okay, so if we kind of go back to our look at Mycenaean development, we've looked now at kind of 1 and 2, and I think this gives us insight into not only some of the things that the Mycenaeans are doing, but also how things are developing. If we look at, say, from 1600 down to 1400, just looking at the material remains in the shaft graves and the thalos tombs, and especially now with the thalos tombs, what this tells us, what they kind of indicate is growing Mycenaean power, growing Mycenaean engineering, abilities in engineering, technique and wealth, and so on. It really, I think the textbook uses the phrase, the thalos tombs kind of mark the appearance of the Mycenaeans on the Mediterranean stage, because by building these, they're really kind of announcing their arrival as a significant power. So this is why your textbook is really emphasizing is the growing power and development of the Mycenaeans. And where this really culminates is in the 3rd phase, which is known as the palace period. It's not until these years, kind of roughly 1400 down to 1200, that we see the building of the palace complexes in their entirety, those kind of aerial views I've been showing you of the Mycenaean sites, both at Mycenae and other places like Turin and so forth. Okay. So if we take a kind of looking back at our floor plan here, it's during this last phase that we see, first of all, the building of the large-scale walls that surround everything, and then also the building of the main palace up top. So it's at this point that we see the encircling of the grave circles, the building of the Lion's Gate, which we'll take a look at right here, and really the large-scale aspects of the palace. So now, if we kind of step back and take a look, here is a view of the palace and the walls. It doesn't look like much there, but it's impressive in terms of just the size and the amount of stones and so forth there. You'll appreciate it more as we kind of take a look at some of the different pictures. But there's just a view of it from, say, from a distance. And here's a view taking a look at, this is a good shot actually, because what we see here, this is the main entry point. So here's the walk up to the Lions Gate right here. But what's good here is this shows you, see this rocky outcrop here? That shows you the kind of natural fortifications. And then what you see is the walls built on top of that. So you can see how, how concerned they were with defense. There's a couple things you could really talk about here. The walls here are extraordinary in terms of the size of the blocks. Now what happens is about, say, 1,000 years after this, later Greeks living in the classical period, when they saw these things, and they had no history, they had no idea kind of who lived here. These things had been abandoned, as we'll see, for a number of years. But when later Greeks in antiquity saw these, they talked about the style of these walls. They called it Cyclopean masonry. That is, masonry walls that they thought could have only been built by a cyclops. A cyclops, of course, as you know, is a creature from Greek mythology. The kind of famous craftsmen and builders. They have the one eye and all that kind of thing, but they're giants, right? They're huge kind of beasts. So the later Greeks thought the only way that these could have been built was by cyclops. So even to the ancient Greeks, they were impressed with the size of these palaces. The next one here, you can see a close-up. So here that gives you just a good sense of the walls there, and there's the Lion's Gate right there. Include one just to give you a sense of the scale there. And again, if you were fighting, it obviously would have been difficult to overcome these walls. And that's another point that is important to bring up is, if we're talking about ancient warfare, basically we're dealing with swords, some sort of throwing weapon like a javelin. They did have chariots, they did have some archery and so forth. But none of those weapons would have been able to breach these walls. They didn't have kind of siege engines like the later Romans did. So the walls, in a sense, are a little bit overkill, as some people have said. Like, you don't need this kind of walls in that kind of environment. But I think we have to understand this as kind of in a way in conjunction with the Thalos tombs. These aren't simply for fortifications or defense to hold somebody off. They're also a boast of military might. When you build something that's so huge, it's clearly meant to send a message of your military power, your military might. So it's, in a sense, a kind of aristocratic display too, just as kind of gold and silver and bronze is, but here in terms of natural of fortifications. Now here's a close-up. You can see the Lion's Gate. So this would be the main entry point to the palace. Now here's the lines here you can see above. Now they're both standing on a pillar. Unfortunately, their heads are missing, and they would have been looking out towards the people coming in. Probably would have been made of bronze and attached. That's pretty normal in antiquity at this time. What's kind of interesting about the Lion's Gate is that, of course, Mycenae was the legendary home of King Agamemnon from Homer. And Agamemnon and his brother Menelaus are often referred to as kind of twin lions. So although, of course, Agamemnon and Menelaus and the Trojan War were dealing with mythology there, perhaps there's some sort of connection with history when we see this. The other thing is, if you take a look at the other side here, it is kind of looking out towards the front, but that really does give you a sense of the scale and just the thickness of some of these walls and so on. Okay. So when we talk about the building of the palaces, this kind of last phase, the walls are a key part of that. And again, the wall is just such a different way of building something than we saw on Crete. Now, if we jump ahead or kind of revert back to our plan here, we've been taking a look at this third kind of phase, the phase of the period of the palaces, and we've taken a look at the Lion's Gate, we've taken a look at the walls, but I want to take a look more specifically at the palace complex and this particular room known as a megaron. All right, you see where it says palace here? Well, this room right here is known as a megaron. It's distinctive to Mycenaean palace. So this is another way of distinguishing between Minoan and Mycenaean palaces. Remember, Minoan palaces revolved around or kind of organized around a central courtyard. The distinguishing feature of one of the distinguishing features of Mycenaean palaces is this megaron. So when we take a look at other palaces at other sites such as Tiryns on the mainland or Pylos, they all have this. So that just tells us a kind of cultural unity, if you will, amongst these different communities. Now, if we want to take a look at a floor plan of a megaron, it's very simple. It's basically just a room. So what you see here, this itself is the megaron, and what it is, it's a kind of basically a closed room. So you can have 4 posts to hold up the roof, because there would be a hole in the roof to let smoke and fire and heat out, because there would be a central hearth right here. Now, what the Megaron seemed to be is a kind of meeting place for the king or for the chief and his followers. So not only a place where they perhaps could kind of feast and drink, but then also, say, receive diplomats or envoys from other communities. So it would be a bit of a forecourt here before people would be brought in and, say, entertained or welcomed there. When you take a look at Mycenae today, this is what it looks like. Again, it doesn't kind of stand out much, but the central area, that's where the hearth or the fire would go. You can see these round things here. Those are the bases for the columns. The columns would be made out of wood and would support the floor. Okay, but then if you look ahead here, that is the forecourt. Now here, of course, these walls would have been built up, so here you can see the surrounding countryside, but originally you wouldn't have. Now, to give you a sense of what it would have looked like in antiquity, here we are. All right, so here's the entry point. You go through here, and then here you can see the hearth, and then it'll be all decorated and painted and so forth, and then you can also see the opening to the sky. All right. So again, this seems to have been the gathering place for the king, the chief, his followers. It was a place for entertaining, it was a place for feasting, it was a place for politics, and so on. But so clearly one of the kind of power centers in these palaces. And as I say, we find them at Mycenae, Pyrrhus, all the places. Okay. So there's a quick overview of the palaces at Mycenae. And that's kind of going back to the beginning. There's really a few things I really want you to remember here. Is first of all, think about the stages of development, how we go from the very early period, which is the shaft graves. Then we move up to the thallus tombs, and those are evidence of growing wealth, power, technique, engineering, the real kind of arrival of the Mycenaeans. And then what we see, the peak or the climax, is with the building of the palaces. This is the kind of height of Mycenaean power, where they kind of exploit all their kind of economic markets, their political advantages, and so forth. So we see tremendous rise in wealth, military power, and then, of course, also, as your textbook reveals, conquest of Minoan culture, where we see the Mycenaeans in some way or another, it's still a little bit cloudy, do exert control over Crete. So we have a good sense of the development and how it kind of matches what we know from other aspects of Mycenaean culture. In terms of the design, again, fortifications, not only taking advantage of natural fortifications, but building up these huge walls, that's very important. Also, taking a look at the grave circle and also the megaron, those kind of features. So just be familiar with some of the defining features of the palace complexes and how they are a little bit different from what we see on Crete. The last thing I want to take a look at here, we talked a little bit about arts and crafts, taking a look at the building of the swords that were found in the shaft graves and so on. But just as in Knossos, all of the walls would have been decorated with frescoes, with painting. Now, what's interesting here is we can similarly see, things that are very much like what we saw in Knossos, but other things that are very different. So just let me give you a few examples here. Right? So here's one fresco. Now, if I were just to show you this, you probably would have thought, oh, that looks like the Minoan ones, because it does, right? In terms of the style of the hair, even the stance and so forth, it clearly looks very similar. So again, interpretation is that, oh, maybe because the Minoan were such famous craftsmen, maybe they did this. They just did it in a style that they were used to. That's a possibility. This next one, you can see that's very similar too, in terms of the stance, the colors used, all those kind of things. It looks Minoan, but again, they're not that much different. Where we start to see a bit of a difference in some of the frescoes, and this kind of keeps in line with what we've seen with other specs. We're just dealing with more of what's known as a warrior culture on the mainland at Mycenae, as opposed to what we saw on Crete and amongst the Minoans. Much greater emphasis amongst the Mycenaeans on martial motifs. That's M-A-R-T-I-A-L, which just means kind of warlike or war motifs. So what we have here are these two warriors on a chariot. Right? Now, a chariot, you all know what that is, but a chariot is basically a weapon used for war. It's like an ancient tank. So this is a military scene, and you can see they're wearing kind of what are known as boar's tusks helmets, and they're carrying kind of javelins and spears and so forth. So what's really being kind of emphasized in these pictures is the military might of the king, of the chief, of his followers, and of Mycenae, their ability to kind of conduct themselves bravely in war and so on. So again, this is just, we don't see these things on Mycenae. So just we're talking about two kind of different cultures. And one last one here. Again, this is a nice fresco. It gives you a sense of all the different colors. But this too, it may not look like it, but this is a military motif too, because these things in the middle that look like figure eights, those are shields. Right, so shields would be made out of, well, they could be made of all sorts of different things, but often ox hide, which is what looks like these are here, could be used because that's very kind of light and you could kind of move quickly and so on. So another thing that's important, as we saw with the Minoans, is that taking a look at their art does kind of give us insight into some of the things they prioritized. And the same thing happens when we take a look at Mycenae, is that the art reflects just, a different mentality than what we see on Crete. So hopefully the slideshow gives you a sense of some of the main features of the Mycenaean palaces and how, if we were to take a look at Tiryns and Pylos, they're all very, very similar. They're all built on rocky outcrops. They all have massive fortifications. They all have a megaron. So there's obviously a cultural unity amongst these different sites, just as we saw on Crete amongst the different Minoan sites. So be familiar with the different aspects of them and the kind of insight they give to us. Okay, so that's it for this slideshow, and we'll move on.